There was a man and his father. So there was a son and a father. And this son, he left his father. He decided, I'm going to go away. I'm going to go on adventure. And he went away into a distant country where he lived for many years. And in this sutra, it says that he went away for 50 years. But all the time in the White Lotus Sutra are extended. So by the time you get to the end of the sutra, he'd probably be about 180 or something. So don't need to take it literally, but it said that he went away 50 years. And while he was away, his father he became a merchant, and he built up lots of wealth. So he had various ventures, and he settled down in different countries, getting richer and richer. So he was moving around and getting richer and richer. But the son didn't do so well. So while the father was getting rich, the son didn't do so well. He hadn't inherited his father's brains, unfortunately. He didn't have the business acumen that his father had. And he remained miserably poor. And he basically went around trying to get the bare minimum. So he was trying to get food, he was trying to get clothing, he was trying to get shelter. So while his father was getting rich, he was out and he was really struggling to make ends meet, basically. And the father was heaping up gold, silver, grain, servants, elephants, horses and cows, carriages, sheep, and he had lots of dependents and followers. So when people built up a lot of wealth in ancient India, they had lots of people that went to them to kind of look after them. So he had lots of people around. So he became a sort of merchant prince, basically. So he was basically a prince with all of this money. But despite all this wealth, despite having all of this, all these riches, the whole time he was thinking of his son. He was thinking of the son that had left him, and how he wanted to be reunited for his son. And he reflected that as he was getting older, he'd built up all of this wealth and he wanted to give that to his son. So he's like, I've built up all of this, but if I don't have anyone to give it to, what's it for? So he wanted to give all of this wealth to his son. But the son had just been roaming from place to place to place, kind of always struggling, always suffering. But eventually, quite by accident, he came to the place where his father was living. But he didn't know that his father was there. It was just coincidence that he came to the land where his father was living. And as he was skulking through the streets, he came across an enormous mansion. And sitting in the door, there was a very rich man surrounded by an enormous company, all holding money and jewels. It's kind of in the image, it says that they're all just kind of stood there, just holding all of these jewels and all of this gold, just kind of feeling it. And it said even the footstool was made of gold and silver. And the man was handling lots of gold pieces, and he was being fanned, and he was sitting under a canopy of silk, which was decorated by garlands of jewels. So even his silk was decorated with all of these jewels. So the poor man, he saw this, and he was terrified, basically. He was terrified. He thought he'd come across a king or some sort of nobleman. And he thought that this is no place for me. I'm a poor, lowly man. This is no place for me. I better get out of here, otherwise they're going to get me and put me to work or something like that. And he didn't recognize his father, so he'd been gone such a long time. When he saw this rich man, he didn't recognize his father. He didn't see that man was his father. But his father recognized him. Straight away, his father saw him from a distance and he saw, that's my son, I can see him. And yeah, he's older, he was probably dirty and covered in dust. But he's like, yeah, that's definitely my son. And he feels overjoyed. He feels overjoyed that finally his son's come back, and he thinks, if I can only hand all of this wealth over to my son, then I can die happily. Once I've given all of this to my son, then I can die happily. So he sends some of his servants after the son to bring him back. So these guards go running to the son to try and get him. But the son is terrified of these guards. They're kind of these noble guards. And as he sees them coming towards him, he thinks he's going to be arrested and probably executed or tortured. So he swoons, basically. He faints and he passes out at the sight of these guards because he's so terrified. Yeah, and the father's surprised, and he tells his guards, "Oh, actually, just leave him be, just leave him be." And he realizes that his son isn't used to being in contact with this amount of status and wealth and riches. He's just not accustomed to that because he's been living in such a poor way. He just isn't accustomed to all of this wealth and riches. And he realizes that although he is his son, there's a great distance, there's a great psychological distance between them because they've been living in such different worlds. So although he's his son, they've been living in such different worlds. And then so given the situation, he decides, oh, actually, I'm not going to tell anyone that he's my son at the moment. I'm just going to keep that to myself until a later time. So after a while, he tells another servant to go and tell the son that he can be free. So he says, oh, you can go. And the son's really relieved and he runs off. And he says, you can go where you want, and he runs off. And then he carries on going around looking for food and clothing and shelter. So the father, realizing that he was so scared by the guards last time, he calls two unattractive, humble and shabby servants. In the parable, it kind of gives a very unflattering description of the servants that he chooses to go and find the poor man. And he tells them to go and hire his son and say that they'll give him double wages. So he's going to hire him, and they're going to hire him, and they're going to give him double wages. So obviously he agrees. And what he's hired for, so behind the mansion, there's just this huge heap of dirt. There's this huge heap of dirt that's accumulated. And he's hired to basically just dig that dirt, clear away that dirt. The poor man takes up an abode in a straw hut. So he goes and he lives in a straw hut, and he spends years and years just clearing away this huge pile of dirt. And the whole time the father is in his mansion, and he can see the straw hut from his mansion. He can see the straw hut that his son's in, and he can watch over him as he's shoveling the dirt, and then every evening he's retiring to the little hut. And then one day, after a long while, so he's been doing this for a long time, he's been doing it for years, and the father puts on some old dirty clothes. He takes a basket and he approaches his son, so he kind of makes himself look more approachable to the son. And they have a chat, and he basically tells him, if you need anything, just ask me. He's saying, you've been really good, you've worked really hard, you've been an ideal worker, so if you need anything, just ask me. And you know what? Think of me as your father, and I'll treat you like you're my son. So he's saying, think as if I'm your father, I'll treat you as if I'm your son. Yeah, but then the son, he carried on clearing away the dirt. He carried on clearing away the big pile, then he carried on living in his straw hut. But after a while, the rich man got sick, and so he got the son into the mansion. He said, I'm going to put you in charge of my estate. I'm going to put you in charge of the mansion. I'm going to put you in charge of my finances. You've been a really good worker. I'm going to train you up so that you can become the manager of my estate. And then so through this way, the son became familiar with the workings of the state. He became familiar with financial affairs, of how to manage this big house with all of the servants. And through time, he got better and better at doing this. He was managing this big mansion. And he went freely in and out of the mansion now as well. So before he was living in the straw hut, but now he's allowed to enter the mansion freely. He's coming and going, but every night he still returns to the straw hut. So although he's working in the mansion, he's still every evening he's going to go and he goes and sleeps in the straw hut. And although he was handling all of this wealth, he still thought, oh no, this belongs to my boss. He didn't realise that it was his father's. He just thought, oh, although I'm in charge of this, it actually belongs to my father. But over the years, he got so used to handling the money, he was so used to walking around in this world, that he started to become accustomed to it. He started to feel like, oh, actually, maybe I want some of this. And he started to think back at the way he was living before and think, oh no, I don't want to live like that anymore. I want to be rich. I want to have this wealth. I want to be comfortable. And at this point, the rich man was at the point of death. So the rich man was really close to death now. And he thought, actually, no, now the time is right to get to tell the truth. So what he did, he gathered all the people in town together. He got all of the people in his estate, everyone from the surrounding town. He got them around, and he said to them, he said, this man who I've been training, he's my son. This whole time he's been my son, and he tells them the whole story about how he took him in, he trained him up, and now this is my son, and I'm going to give all of my wealth, all of my estate over to the son. And then, in front of everyone, he gives him his inheritance. He gives him all of the wealth. And then the son rejoiced in his good fortune of finding his father and being given all of the wealth. Yeah. So that's the end of the story. So, maybe you might have got some of the what that story is trying to get at. But what we're going to do now, we're going to unpack different aspects of it. So the beginning of the story, the son leaves his father, doesn't he? So he went around looking for work, left the father, went around looking for food, work and clothing. And because he was so poor, because he was having to scrounge and scrape to get by, he suffered greatly. And at the same time, his father was getting rich. So the possibility of a life of wealth was there for him, but because he left, he wasn't able to access it because he was going around and he was suffering. And one way that we could look at that is that we separate ourselves from reality. So we separate ourselves off from experience, from reality, and we think of ourselves as independent things here, independent of a world out there. And this is the root of our suffering. This is the reason why we suffer. So I'm going to kind of unpack this in a metaphor. So I'm going to kind of expand the metaphor, and hopefully it will make a bit of sense as to why that happens. So the metaphor I want to use is basically to think of land. So think before there was any civilization, before there was any settlements, there's just this vast land. So we've got hills and trees and stuff like that, but there's just all of this land. And although different bits looked different, really all there is land. So there's all of these different things. But at some point, people would have started labelling the land. They'd have started saying, this is a hill, this is a tree, this is a river. And they might even start calling it names. So this is the River Thames and this is Box Hill and stuff like that. So they start putting labels on things. And you can see how this is helpful. So it's helpful because if you want to meet up with someone, you'd say, let's meet here, or you'd make a map in your mind and you'd know, after this hill there's that river. So you can see how mapping out the land is useful, because you can talk about places, you can have a map in your head, but the problem is it's not long before people start taking that literally as well. So the labels are then literalized. So it's not that this is a hill that for the sake of convenience we are going to refer to as Box Hill. You just think, no, that is Box Hill. And the same with the River Thames. So you kind of literalise it. And so we've separated the land into different parts. And then at some point, people started taking ownership for different bits of land. So you'd say, okay, this bit of land here, this is my bit of land. And that bit of land over there, that's your bit of land. And again, you can see how that's useful. If you wanted to build settlements, you'd say, okay, now this is helpful. We'll be here and you'll be there. And in a way, there's no problem with that. But the problem is when people start to take that literally. So it's kind of like, no, this is my land and that's your land, and you've literalized it. And then once you feel like, this is literally my piece of land, then people feel like they need to start protecting it. They need to start preserving it. They need to start enhancing it. So you say, okay, this is my land, that's your land. But actually, I quite like that bit over there. So maybe I'm going to encroach there. Or you might think, actually, I can see those people are coming a bit close to the edge of my land there. So then you start getting defensive and you start having to protect it. And you can see how actually on a big scale, that's basically how wars start, is that there's these different bits of land taken literally, and then they're fighting over the bits of land. So you can see that throughout all of history. So that's basically a metaphor for what we're doing all of the time. So there's experience, there's all of this experience, and we label parts of experience because it's useful. So we'd say, okay, I'm Sanghadharin, that's a cushion, that's a door, and they're the lights. And you can see how actually that's fine, that's neutral and that's helpful. So it means we could communicate. So you could say, Sanghadharin, could you walk through the door and turn on the lights? And it helps us navigate the world. But the problem is when we start to take these things literally. So we take me, we have this idea that there's this part here, which is me, and we take that literally. So there's me here, and there's everything out there, and we think that's the literal truth. Even though the me here is completely dependent on everything else out there. So it's dependent on food, on water, on heat, on air. Even our thoughts are completely conditioned on everything else we're coming into contact with. But even though we're so dependent on everything outside of ourselves, we take it literally in here. And then because of this delusion, because we see ourselves as this is literally me here, we then say, the same as with the piece of land, we start to feel like we need to protect it. We start to feel like we need to preserve it, and we start to feel like we need to enhance it. And this is where craving and aversion comes from. It's this sort of constant pushing and pulling with reality. So we want things, so we pull them towards us, and we don't want things, or we feel like we're threatened by things, so we push them away. And this is where all of our suffering comes from. So because we're pushing and pulling with reality, that's why we're suffering. And so can you see how it's that separating ourselves out from everything else that then leads us to suffering? So just like the man leaving his father leads to all of his suffering, it's us separating ourselves out and taking ourselves literally from the rest of the world. That's where all of our suffering comes from. So that's one way we could look at this beginning of the story. So it's the separation from the Father, which is like the separation of ourselves from reality. So yeah, he's traveling around for a long time. And he's trying to find food, trying to find shelter, and eventually he comes to the place where his father is, and he sees his father sees him, and his father sends out the guards to go and bring him back. So he's overjoyed because, my son's back. He sends the guards out, but the son's so terrified of the guards that he passes out, and the father realizes that he isn't ready for the truth. That all the wealth belongs to him. He's not ready to receive the truth that actually this is yours. And this basically represents what would happen to us if we were confronted with enlightenment right now. It's quite funny because if you really think about it, a lot of us here are practicing because we want to move towards enlightenment. But if you're asked, okay, you can be enlightened tomorrow, and then you think, do you actually want that? And then you think, oh, of course. But then you think about all the things it would actually mean and all the things that we want to let go of, and you start to think, actually, I don't know if I am ready. I don't know if I am ready for that. And this is basically what this is representing, that if we were confronted with the enlightened state right now, we would be overwhelmed. We wouldn't know what to do. It would be too vast. It would be too sublime, too different from our ordinary experience, that we wouldn't know what to do, and we would be overwhelmed. So in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it talks about at the moment of death, we're confronted by what it calls the bright white light of reality, and we're confronted with it, but we're not able to accept it or embrace it. So what happens is we withdraw from it, or we close down and shrink away from it. And so this is why we need to approach the truth gradually. This is why we need a path. So the Buddha realized it would be too hard for people to grasp what he was talking about straight away. It's too subtle, it's too sublime. And that's why he taught a path, so that people could gradually move towards it. But I want us to think about, have we had an experience where we feel like we've encountered something that's a lot bigger than we're used to encountering? So people often come because they've had some sort of experience that feels so much bigger than anything else they've experienced. So it might be something really beautiful that is just too beautiful. It might be something that's it might be something devastating. It might be something really difficult. but they're like these truths. It's encountering a truth that's too big, too vast for us to gauge where we are, and would take a long time to unpack it. So what I'm going to ask is just to get in threes and just talk about, have you had an experience where you feel like you've encountered something that's much bigger than your ordinary state of mind or your ordinary experiences? So yeah, just talk for a few minutes if you turn and get into threes. So keep those experiences in mind, because it's going to be relevant to what we go on to now. But yeah, keep any of your personal experiences in mind for what we're about to move on to. So yeah, we're in the story. The son has glimpsed his father. He's seen all of the wealth. He's seen all of the riches, and his father wants to give him his inheritance, but he knows that he's not ready to receive it. He knows that he's not going to be able to handle receiving all the riches. So he can see that a transformation is needed. He can see that there needs to be a transformation in his son so that he can be ready. So what he does, he hires him and he puts him to work, and he starts him with shoveling dirt. So he's like, that will be something that he can put his hand to. He can start shoveling the dirt. And this could represent what we call the path of vision and the path of transformation. So there's these two aspects of spiritual life. There's a path of vision and a path of transformation. So the son has glimpsed the wealth. He's seen the father. He's seen the money. He's seen the wealth. He's glimpsed what could be his. But he needs to transform himself so that he's ready. And what we call this is a glimpse of perfect vision. So often the spiritual life begins with a glimpse of perfect vision. And what you were just talking about there might be one of those glimpses where we glimpse something that's so much bigger than we're used to. So it could be reading something. It could be hearing someone say something. It could be an experience of meditation. It could even just be seeing someone or seeing something, maybe an experience in nature or an experience of music or of art or of a play or anything that kind of opens us up to something that's way bigger than our ordinary state of mind and makes us feel like, I need to change myself in according with this. And what happens is when we encounter these things, we instinctively know that we've encountered a truth. Even if we can't rationally make sense of it, even if we can't reason our way through it, we instinctively, intuitively know that we've encountered a truth. And I had this the first time I read a book on Buddhism. I'd been meditating for a little while, but I'd never learnt about the Buddha's teachings. And the first time I read a book, I just had this strong sense of this kind of intuitively knowing it was true. So I remember I was sat on a train, and I can remember exactly what I was reading about. And I was just going, yep, that's true. Yep, that's true. Yep, that's true. Yep, that's true. And it was nothing I'd come across before. It was nothing that I'd thought through, nothing that someone had told me, but just intuitively, instinctively, there was a response to know, no, this is definitely the truth. Even though this isn't how I am right now, this is the truth, and I want to try and move myself towards this. It was like the deepest part of myself was responding and resonating with what I was reading. And when we've had these glimpses of perfect vision, we then need to start the path of transformation. So there's the path of vision and the path of transformation. So we have these glimpses, but then we need to do the slower, the more difficult work of bringing the rest of our lives up to our moments of perfect vision. So it's really important that we have the sense of, there's something beyond where I am. But then actually we then need to start the longer, more difficult work of transforming. And this requires a consistent effort and patience as well. So we need to be applying ourselves to practice, and we need to be patient with the results. And in this way, it's like shoveling dirt. So some aspects of practicing the Dharma, some aspects of working on our mind might sometimes feel like you're just shoveling a massive pile of dirt for years, just to let you know. But there's also the glimpses. So you could think of vision as seeing the wealth, seeing the riches, seeing the jewels of the mind. So it's really important that we're in touch with that as much as we can be. We're in touch with the fact that there are riches in the mind. There is wealth. There is the wealth of the mind. But also we need to transform as well. And we could think of that as like working with the dirt of the mind. So we need to acknowledge that actually there are riches in the mind, but there's also dirt in the mind. And we need to be moving towards the riches, but we also need to be working with the dirt. We need to be shoveling the dirt. So we need to start by getting to know ourselves. Basically, that's one of the first places to start in practicing Buddhism, is we need to get to know ourselves and we need to get to know our tendencies. And this takes time as well, so we can't do this quickly. And we can often, even if we've been working on a tendency for a long time, we can start to see it manifesting in more subtle ways or in different ways than we're used to. And we need to learn to work creatively with them. So we need to know what our unhelpful tendencies are, and we need to learn to work creatively with them. And we also need to work to be cultivating positive and creative mental states. And it's like there are two poles of spiritual experience. So we've got the path of vision and the path of transformation. And it's like there's these two poles of spiritual practice. Now, I don't take this literally, but you could think of there's these two poles. One is the kind of more personal, psychological aspect of practice. It's the seeing my mind as it is clearly, my personal mind, my conditioning, my habits, all the things that I get myself into. And then the other end of the pole is the more universal, transcendental truths that we need to reflect on and realise through time. And yeah, shoveling this heap of dirt is very much an image for the personal, psychological end of the pole. Getting to know ourselves, working on our ethics, working on our mind in meditation. And yeah, in the parable, this is to prepare the son to start working in the mansion. So the father puts him to work, shoveling the dirt, but there's no point where the father thinks, oh yeah, he can just stay doing that forever. It's never like, oh, that's his job, he's the sort of person who just shovels dirt. He's making him do that so that he can be ready, so that when he's ready, he can put him in charge and he can start handling the estate, start handling the wealth, start handling the money. And so we do this, this work that we're doing, this personal psychological pole of practice, we're doing that so that we can prepare our mind so that it's ready to start encountering these more universal truths, these dharmic truths that will start helping us see the way things really are. So yeah, there's these two aspects of practice. We've got the path of vision, path of transformation, or this personal psychological end of the pole, and then the universal truths. So after many years, his father saw, after many years of shoveling the dirt, his father saw that actually he's ready to start working in the mansion now. And he puts him in charge of the finances of the estate. And the son's allowed to come in and out of the house freely. But even though he was working in the mansion, he was coming in and out of the mansion freely, he still went home to his straw hut every night. And this starting to handle the money represents that at some point, flashes of wisdom will start to dawn on us. We'll have moments where we start to see much more clearly. We'll have moments where we see, now the veil has lifted. All of the fog, all of the mist that was in the way is lifted, and I'm seeing much more clearly. And we'll start to see the deeper truths that the Buddha's teachings are pointing towards. So when we first encounter the Buddha's teachings, we might be inspired by them, we might resonate with them on some level, but they might seem like an idea. They might seem, I kind of get that on an intellectual level, and I kind of agree with it, but I've never experienced that. But at some point, if we keep practicing, we'll have moments where we start to see, actually, what the Buddha taught is true. And we'll see that in our direct experience. And so we'll have these flashes of wisdom, we'll have flashes of insight, whatever you want to call it. And we might feel that our experience, our mind has completely opened, but inevitably it will then close back down. We'll have a big opening, but then it will close back down. And we'll return to our ordinary state of mind, or what feels like our ordinary state of mind. And in a way, this is like the son, he enters the palace, but every night he then goes home to his straw hut. So he's in the palace, but then he goes home to his straw hut. And if you've been on retreat, you might be able to resonate with this image. So when you're on retreat, if you've been there for a few days, been there for a week, 2 weeks, you start to enter a completely different way of being. Your mind starts to open up, you're not bothered by the things you normally are, you're starting to see clearly, you're starting to feel much more deeply. You kind of enter you could think of it as like you enter a different realm. And at this point you're very much in the palace. You're kind of like, when we're on retreat, we're in the palace, we're in touch with more than we are in our ordinary lives. But then once we're off retreat, after a week or two, we kind of feel our ordinary mind just kind of back to normal, and we go back to our, like, what feels like our ordinary state of mind. And it's like we've returned to the straw hut. So on retreat, we're in the palace, and then we've got to come home, and then before too long, it feels like we're back in the straw hut again. But the more we go on retreat, the more we enter those states of mind on retreat, the more our life at home starts to feel closer to it. Our at-home mind starts to become closer to our retreat mind. And it's the same with wisdom. It's the same with this aspect. The more familiar we become with these experiences of wisdom, insight, whatever we want to call it, the closer to that our ordinary mind becomes. The gap becomes smaller. And this is represented in the parable by the son becoming familiar with handling the riches. So at first the riches were too far away. He was intimidated by them. He was scared by them. He even passed out at one point. But as he's worked on himself, he's starting to handle the riches. He's starting to become accustomed to it. He's starting to become familiar with it. And there's an interesting point in the story where the son starts to feel repulsed by the way he was living before. And he starts to want to become rich himself. Now, saying that he feels repulsed by the way he was living doesn't sound very kind to his old self. But I think what this is getting at is an image for, there's a point in the spiritual life where the pull of the spiritual life will become stronger than the pull of our worldly ambitions, of our creature comforts, of our sense desires. So at first, worldly goals and sense pleasures will be so enticing, they'll have such a strong pull on us, that actually it takes a lot of effort to work towards more spiritual aims, more spiritual goals. And it's kind of like the gravitational pull is very much towards worldly ambitions and sense pleasures, and that's where we all begin, that's where we all are. But then at some point, the gravitational pull of spiritual goals, of spiritual aims, you could say the gravitational pull of enlightenment becomes stronger. And actually, we won't be so interested in the way that we were before. We won't be so interested in our ambitions, in our accruing possessions of getting wealth and pleasure. And we'll be more drawn towards moving towards enlightenment, moving towards these states of wisdom. Now at the end of the parable, the father announces that the son is actually his heir. So up until that point, no one knew that the man was his son. They just thought he was someone that had worked his way up. But he announces, actually, this is my son. He's always been my son. This is inheritance. It's always been his inheritance, and he hands over the whole of his wealth to him. And the son receives the inheritance that he didn't realise was his. And he's overjoyed. And I think it's significant that in this parable it's his inheritance. It's as if the money had always been his. It's not that he earned the money in the parable. I think this is significant. It's not that he got a job and he kind of just built up and he was sensible with his money. He had a savings pot and he gradually built it up to the point where he was rich. It's that this inheritance was always his all along. Even though he was working for it, even though he was working for his father, the inheritance was always going to be his. It was always his. And it's as if Buddhahood or enlightenment is our inheritance. It's as if by being a human being, enlightenment is our birthright. It's the birthright of every human being. And it's like it's there waiting for us. We just don't know it. So it's as if enlightenment is our inheritance. But it's also significant that the father couldn't give it to him straight away. If he'd given it to him straight away, he would have been overwhelmed. He wouldn't have known what to do. He needed to work and he needed to train up so that he was ready to receive it. And in the same way that Buddhahood is there waiting for us, if we were to encounter it right now, we wouldn't be ready. We wouldn't be able to inhabit it. So we need to work hard. We need to practice. We need to practice working on our mind. The Buddha teaches this path to give us practices to do and ways of being that we can move towards it. And we can become more familiar with those states of mind. We can become more familiar with the Dharma. And at some point we'll be ready to realise what the Buddha realised, but that's through work, it's through practice. So although it's our inheritance, although it's our birthright, we need to work to get there, we need to practice, we need to move along a path, we need to move along a journey. And in the first half we discussed the different ways of looking at the path. So one is that the path is a journey, so we're here and we need to move along there, we need to travel along that path towards enlightenment. And another was that Buddhahood is already within us and we just need to find it, we need to discover it, which was sometimes referred to as Buddha nature. And each way will have its strengths and weaknesses. The journey implies that we're travelling towards something, we're moving in a direction, but it can seem that it's too far, too distant, too impossible. And Buddha nature implies that enlightenment is already here, which could feel like, oh, I'm in touch with it, it's close. But it could also lead us to thinking that we don't need to do anything. But can you see how this myth, this story, the parable of the return journey, it unites these two perspectives? So enlightenment is our inheritance. It's always there waiting for us. As a human being, it's our birthright that we're moving, that's there waiting for us, but we're not ready to receive it yet. So we need to follow a path in order to be ready to receive it, so that we learn how to be in relation to it, how to use it, might we say. So this myth, it unites the ways of looking at spiritual life, and it shows us that they're not contradictory. Because when we discussed them in the first half, they seemed quite like polarities of very different ends. But what this myth does, it kind of unites them to show how they're different aspects of the same thing. So we do need to practice, we do need to work, but to get something that's always there and always possible for us. And yeah, it's through practicing and developing on the path that we realise that enlightenment was there all along.